Hey there. Tonight, we're stepping into a world that's equal parts elegance, agony, and artifice. A place where every movement is choreographed, every glance is calculated, and your knees will never forgive you. And trust me, you'll want to stick around until the end, because what's waiting behind those sliding paper doors isn't just the secret to perfect posture. It's a story with a twist you probably didn't see coming. If you genuinely enjoy this kind of immersive dive into weird history, go ahead and like and subscribe, but only if it feels right. And hit up the comments to tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's see how far this bedtime gathering stretches. Now, dim the lights, find the softest pillow, and settle in. This journey is about to get delightfully uncomfortable. You are born into Edo. Imagine a city pulsing with the shuffle of silk slippers, the clink of teacups, and the hum of 1,000 secrets. The air smells like rain on wood, rice steam, and the faint, ever-present anxiety of people who might be descended from samurai, or just desperately want to be. You're a girl, which, in your particular century, means your future has been conveniently narrowed down to 3 time-honored career paths. You can marry someone who collects scrolls and leaves his socks everywhere, become a nun, and spend your twilight years talking to stone statues, or enter the mysterious Okiya, the Geisha house, where you'll dedicate your waking hours to pouring sake for men who mistake your politeness for romance. The word empowerment hasn't quite made it to your vocabulary yet. You are 6. Your favorite hobby is poking beetles with sticks, and you still believe that adults have your best interests at heart. This is adorable and also incorrect, because today, under the pretense of a family outing, you're being paraded through crowded streets in your nicest kimono, a garment so stiff and scratchy it feels like sleeping in a haystack. If haystacks were designed by sadists with a flair for floral embroidery. Your parents walk ahead, faces set in the polite, resigned mask of people dropping off a package they hope will one day become famous. The Okiya itself is an architectural mood swing, half library, half monastery, with a dash of haunted mansion. The woman who opens the door is Okaya-san, the house mother. She has the supernatural ability to assess your market value with a single surgical glance. You try to smile, but she just blinks, expressionless, as if to say, "I've seen optimism before, and it never ends well." Your parents bow so deeply you worry they've lost something on the floor. They whisper a few ceremonial words, and, just like that, you're left behind in what amounts to the world's most elegant hostage exchange. Congratulations. You are not adopted. You are inventory. You will remember this later, most likely while mopping a floor at midnight and calculating how much you owe the house for the privilege of eating leftover rice. You have become a shikomi, which is an ancient Japanese term for child-shaped cleaning robot. Your job description is simple: scrub, sweep, fetch, and above all, remain invisible. You prepare baths, carry buckets that weigh more than you do, and quickly learn to cry in absolute silence. The key is to become emotionally waterproof. The geisha themselves glide through the halls like ghostly empresses, hair lacquered into gravity-defying shapes, faces powdered into porcelain masks, steps so silent you start to suspect they hover. Their eyes flicker in your direction, only to remind you, wordlessly, that you are breathing too loudly. You are a walking sponge in wooden sandals, but you are watching, always watching. And if your knees survive the first year, you might someday graduate from invisible servant to decorative background prop. Your day begins before sunrise. It ends when your body is approximately 60% ache. You sweep tatami mats until the straw blurs, stoke charcoal fires that fill the air with an ancient smoky perfume, and launder kimono more valuable than your entire extended family. You fetch slippers, then different slippers, then the correct slippers, and yes, there is always a correct pair, and you're always holding the wrong one. By noon, you've walked enough to qualify for a minor pilgrimage, and your muscles are filing daily grievances. Heaven help you if you clatter, trip, or speak above a whisper. Shikomi are required to be as silent as ancient tombs. If you're spoken to, answer quickly, but not too quickly. If you're looked at, look away, but not so fast that it's rude. If you blink, do so with the measured gravity of a diplomat negotiating an arms deal. There are no lessons, no classrooms, and certainly no How to Geisha for Dummies scrolls. Your education is pure osmosis, a steady drip of humiliation, repetition, and observational anxiety. You learn to fold an obi by watching someone do it at warp speed. Then you try it yourself, only to discover that cloth, like people, doesn't always cooperate. You practice bowing until your vertebrae mutter threats of open rebellion. You pour tea until your hands shake, and you struggle not to cry when your third attempt ends with a puddle and a sigh. Somehow, through a combination of fear, repetition, and the slow erosion of your sense of self, you start to catch on. You notice the way a fan is tilted just so, how laughter is deployed like a strategic grenade, and how walking is less about moving and more about gliding as if you're made of mist and self-doubt. You realize that geisha aren't just living art. They're precision machines, powered by social reflexes and a secret stash of inner snark. But you are still, officially, a shikomi. This is code for invisible until needed, then only marginally acknowledged. The older girls may be generous, or they may treat you as a cautionary tale with legs. Either way, you keep your head down, ears open, and ambitions on low simmer. Here's the great cosmic joke. Every geisha, no matter how poised and otherworldly, started exactly where you are now, scrubbing the same floor, enduring the same critiques, and learning that even drying chopsticks can be a disciplinary event. You endure. You wait. You master the ancient art of being present, but not present, useful, but not memorable. It's a delicate balance, not unlike being the Wi-Fi router in a house full of influencers, indispensable, yet taken for granted. Now that you've achieved a black belt in carrying trays and suppressing your existence, you're offered a promotion of sorts. No, you're not learning the shamisen yet. Don't flatter yourself. First, you must conquer the Everest of Japanese tradition, sitting. Specifically, the posture of Seiza, which translates roughly as the ancient and honorable method of destroying your knees. You kneel, legs folded neatly underneath you, back ramrod straight, hands resting demurely. After 3 minutes, your legs are tingling. After 5, they're numb. By 10 minutes, You are convinced that your lower body is plotting an escape, but you cannot wriggle, fidget, or even grimace. You must sit with the serene expression of a Zen monk who has achieved enlightenment and possibly lost all sensation below the waist. Bowing becomes your new hobby. There are at least 30 variations, each with its own invisible rules and subtle shadings. There's the greeting bow, the gratitude bow, the apology bow, and the please don't punish me for existing bow. You lower your head to the perfect angle, hold it for the exact number of heartbeats, and rise with the elegance of a willow branch undulating in the breeze. Inevitably, you mess up. You bow too quickly, or not deeply enough, or catastrophe. Your fingers graze the floor at the wrong angle. Correction comes swiftly, with the gentle severity of a disappointed ancestor. You also practice sitting through tea ceremonies, an endurance test in which your knees become numb, your back becomes a question mark, and your soul contemplates reincarnation as a jellyfish. Every move is slow, fluid, almost underwater. If you sneeze, you may as well pack your bags and join the nuns. Somewhere between the cramps and the existential dread, a transformation begins. You start to walk taller, move more quietly, and disappear into the rhythm of the house. You become less child, more shadow, a silent observer learning to master the art of beautiful invisibility. And here's the secret that no one writes in the history books. Geisha training isn't about endless performance or fan-fluttering theatrics. It's about relentless, almost absurd control over your body, your voice, your every visible impulse. You're learning to vanish in plain sight, to become the living embodiment of grace under pressure, and to do it all with a smile that never quite reaches your eyes. So, you endure physically, emotionally, and socially. You become fluent in the language of strategic politeness, the subtle art of surviving tradition, and the quiet pride that comes from making suffering look effortless. You wait for the day when you'll be more than a silent helper, when you'll step into the light, kimono trailing, and finally matter. After years of scrubbing floors, developing a permanent case of numb knees, and perfecting the art of vanishing, you finally reach the moment you've been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Because next, you'll be invited to transform, not just in name, but in every gesture, every glance, every step. In the next chapter, we'll discover what it means to become a Maiko, and why the most important skills of a geisha in training are the ones no one ever sees. After years of floor scrubbing, knee torture, and developing the posture of a demure statue, you finally hear the words you've been longing for. After years spent perfecting the delicate art of looking invisible yet omnipresent, you finally hear the phrase that every exhausted Minarai longs for. You're ready to become a Maiko. In the hallowed bureaucratic hierarchy of Kyoto's Hanamachi, it's less. You've made it, and more. Congratulations, you're now eligible for a whole new category of suffering. Think of it as your official upgrade from spectral servant to ornamental human furniture. Your posture is impeccable. Your smile is fixed, and your internal monologue is mostly lamentations about cartilage loss. But now the real performance begins. The transformation from ordinary adolescent to Maiko, apprentice geisha, isn't so much a rite of passage as it is a comprehensive reimagining of what it means to be physically uncomfortable. Step 1. The hair. Forget your old top knot or those fleeting dreams of running a comb through free-flowing locks. Professional stylists descend upon you with lacquer, wax, and enough pins to repel a Mongol horde. They work in near-religious silence, sculpting your hair into the iconic Nihongami style, a towering confection of loops, wings, and glossy black ramps that looks effortless but requires hours of engineering and the kind of patience usually reserved for assembling intergalactic probes. One sneeze, one stray bead of sweat, and the whole structure threatens collapse. To preserve this gravity-defying achievement, you must now sleep with your head perched on a takamakura, a small wooden neck support that lifts your skull just far enough off your futon to keep the hairdo untouched by mortal linens. Untouched, that is, by comfort or sanity. The first few nights are a fever dream of neck cramps and existential regret. You wake up convinced you've been beheaded, but no, you're simply living the dream where sleep is a test of willpower and your pillow has all the give of a parking curb. Now comes the ensemble. You thought kimono was simply elegant robes for special occasions. Now you know better. The Maiko's kimono is a wearable tapestry, stitched in elaborate patterns that telegraph the season, your age, your training status, and probably your blood type. The sleeves are so long you could use them to mop the floor behind you, and the hem trails behind like a parade of silk ghosts. The whole thing weighs as much as a family reunion's worth of grudges. The obi, your wide decorative sash, is tied in a knot so complex it requires 2 assistants and a minor in topology. The knot sits high on your back, a firm reminder that your center of gravity belongs to tradition now, not to physics. Dressing is a team sport. At least 3 people converge to wrap, tug, and secure 30 feet of silk around your body until you're 75% kimono and 25% the embodiment of regret. Every layer is a lesson in patience. Every tug is a reminder beauty in this lineage is engineered by committee. Once you're encased in your ceremonial armor, it's time for the finishing touches. Kanzashi, hair ornaments so ornate, so razor-edged, they could double as both high art and self-defense. Each pin and comb signals your rank and the season. Wear the wrong one, and you'll broadcast your ignorance to everyone within a 5-mile radius. The correct kanzashi says, "Yes, I am a novice, but I am a novice who knows better than to wear cherry blossoms in November. Forgetting this is a fashion crime, and the penalty is eternal side-eye from your elders. As a freshly minted Maiko, your job is to be seen, not heard. You move through the tea house like a living painting, poised, silent, and perpetually on the verge of toppling over under the weight of your own sleeves. You serve tea, you bow. You imitate your seniors with the intensity of someone studying for a final exam that never ends. Conversation is discouraged. Laughter is suspicious. Questions are outright dangerous. You are not a participant. You are an exhibit. If you feel yourself developing an opinion, suppress it. That's for later. Possibly never. All this discomfort, all this artifice, and yet there's a flicker of something else. You're visible now. After years of being a shadow, people notice you. Not just because you look like a walking festival, but because you've crossed a threshold. You haven't arrived, exactly, but you're finally on display, and that's something. But don't be fooled into thinking there's a single triumphant moment where you become a Maiko. There's no magical instant, no sudden transformation. It's a slow-motion emergence, like watching a butterfly crawl out of a very expensive, very heavy chrysalis. Rituals blend into one another, and you're never quite sure when you stopped being invisible and started being art. Then the official debut arrives. Your misedashi, your formal coming out. This is the Edo period equivalent of a debutante ball, except instead of waltzing, you kneel until your legs threaten rebellion. Instead of punch, you get 2 hours of hair styling with hot wax and a faint whiff of panic. You don your most opulent kimono yet, layers upon layers of silk in colors so vibrant they could signal ships from space. The obi is tied in the dirari style, trailing down your back like a silk comet. This sash is the universal symbol for, please admire my suffering, I earned it. On this day, your face is transformed. A thick layer of white rice powder is applied from your hairline down to your collarbones, turning your skin into a luminous canvas. Red and black pigments trace your eyes with an elegant severity, and your lips, painted in a delicate half-bow of red, announce to the world that you are new, modest, and only allowed to express yourself in fractions. The half-lip is tradition's way of saying, don't get ahead of yourself. You walk through the streets in your okobo, those iconic platform sandals that combine the height of fashion with the ergonomics of a cinder block. Every footstep is a small act of defiance against gravity and common sense. The crowd parts as you pass, not because you're famous, but because everyone recognizes the shimmering misery of a novice. You move at a glacial pace, each step a negotiation between pride and the fear of face-planting on polished stones. Then it's time for your misedashi. The elders assemble. Patrons arrive, folding fans at the ready, judging with the serene intensity of people who have spent decades perfecting the art of disappointment. You bow, you serve, you smile, you perform. Every gesture is graded, if not allowed, then by 100 tiny cues. And if you falter, no one shouts. Instead, they sigh, a sound that says, we expected so much, and you have delivered only a moderate disaster. The disappointment is profound, and somehow that's worse than any scolding. But you make it through. You don't trip over your trailing sleeves. You don't spill tea. You don't accidentally break into interpretive dance in a fit of nerves. In Geisha terms, this is a triumph on par with conquering Everest in Zori sandals. Now, you are a Maiko, in earnest, half teenager, half porcelain idol, and full-time performance piece. Your life is now a continuous relay of responsibilities, pouring tea, mastering dance, and perfecting the art of pretending not to hear questionable remarks from wealthy patrons. But above all, there is your most sacred daily duty, your face. The makeup routine is less beauty ritual, more military campaign. Step 1. Slather your skin in white powder that smells faintly of ritual and strongly of industrial adhesive. The powder dries almost instantly, leaving you with the complexion of a haunted snowdrift. Forget breathing. Pores are for amateurs. Next, your eyebrows are erased, then redrawn in thin, determined lines with charcoal, each one more serious than the last. Your eyes are outlined in dramatic reds and blacks, applied with brushes so tiny you wonder if they were designed for ants. The slightest twitch, and you've transformed from elegant apprentice to tragic kabuki raccoon. There's no eyeliner, not really, just powdered minerals and the taste of despair. Lips come last, only the bottom one, shaped into a perfect crimson bow. The logic behind this is pure tradition. Some say it represents modesty, others the status of your training. In practice, it mostly ensures that eating anything more substantial than a sigh is a logistical nightmare. Smudge the lip, start over. Uneven line, remove everything and try again. Mistakes are not tolerated, and your face must be flawless, even if your internal monologue is a continuous scream. When you look in the mirror, you see something uncanny. Not quite yourself, but not entirely other. You become a living doll, luminous, inscrutable, and just fragile enough to convince everyone to handle you with ceremonial caution. Beneath the layers of paint and silk, you're learning a new kind of power. Your appearance commands attention. It's not vanity, it's armor. The mask separates you from the mundane world, reminding everyone, including you, that you are here to perform, not participate. You wear this face for the world, not for yourself. It's a signal, a warning, and a challenge. I am tradition made flesh, and I will silently judge your chopstick technique from across the room. It also signals to your paws that they are now living on borrowed time. Hope you weren't too attached to normal skin function, but the real tools of your trade aren't the makeup or the kimono, or even the kanzashi that could double as concealed weaponry. The true weapons are subtler, the shamisen, and the art of social navigation. You take up the shamisen, a three-stringed instrument that looks like a cross between a spatula and a medieval paddle, and sounds somewhere between a mournful banjo and an existential crisis in musical form. You practice for hours, fingers cramping, as your teachers listen for every wrong note with the forbearance of saints and the judgment of demigods. Miss a note, and you receive a sigh. Miss two, and there's a raised eyebrow. After three, you're exiled to retune the instrument and ponder your life choices. Yet music is only half the curriculum. The rest is conversation, a far more dangerous art. You learn to talk without saying anything, to flatter without fawning, to gently deflect awkward questions with the grace of a seasoned diplomat. If a client brags about his wealth, you smile and comment on the beauty of the moon. If someone flirts too boldly, you praise his taste in footwear and pour more sake. You become a black belt in conversational aikido, redirecting every advance into harmless banter. You memorize poetry, hundreds of verses about cherry blossoms, flowing rivers, and heartbreak. You practice quoting basho while pouring tea, all while keeping one eye on the room's mood and the other on your own posture. Everything is a test. How you laugh when you pause, how you recover from an off-color joke. None of this is about entertainment. It's about emotional management. Yours, your clients, sometimes even your superiors. You become a silent conductor, orchestrating the mood of every gathering, always reading the room, always ready with a gentle laugh or a strategic silence. By now, it's clear. Being a maiko is less about dazzling the crowd than about surviving tradition. The rituals, the discomfort, the endless emotional labor. These are your real lessons. You are musician, therapist, etiquette enforcer, and performance artist, all rolled into one exquisitely lacquered package. And the scary thing is, you're getting good at it. Every awkward bow, every aching step in your okobo, every artfully evasive conversation. These are the hidden skills that sustain the illusion. And just as you're starting to believe you've mastered the ancient art of ceremonial suffering, you discover that there is another, even more complex challenge waiting. Because now, you're not just navigating hairpins and posture. Now comes the subtle dance of patronage, rivalry, and the ever-shifting currents of power. Ah, yes. Let's talk about the dana. The word itself sounds refined, almost like something you'd order from a menu if you didn't know what it meant. But in reality, the dana is less mysterious benefactor and more financially entangled marionette master. Picture this: a wealthy man, usually old enough to remember when kimonos were considered edgy, who funds your artistic life with strings attached, strings you can't see until you're already tangled in them. From your first week in the ukiya, the house elders whisper about danas with the reverence of people describing rare wild animals, dangerous, beautiful, and likely to consume you if you're not careful. A dana, you're told, is a gentleman who appreciates refined conversation, supports your training, and foots the bill for your mountain of silk and lacquered hair ornaments. In return, you're expected to flatter his ego, keep him entertained, and never let it show that you'd rather be sleeping than listening to him recount the glory days of his family's rice brokerage. Forget romance. This isn't a Jane Austen wedding fantasy with witty repartee and longing glances over a dance card. This is a business deal, camouflaged in brocade and incense. And just in case you thought you'd get a say, you don't choose your dana, the house does. Your okiya's matron sizes up potential patrons like a jeweler examining pearls, weighing their fortunes and reputations against the risk of scandal or boredom. Meanwhile, you practice your best. I'm utterly fascinated face for the day you're introduced to a man who wheezes more than he speaks and thinks. Avant-garde means wearing navy blue. Let's clear up a common misconception. Not every dana expects certain services. Some are truly patrons of the arts, men who want nothing more than to be surrounded by beauty and clever conversation, at a safe, dignified distance. Others, well, let's say they're more interested in seeing what happens when the shamisen music stops. The boundaries are never spelled out. There's no contract, no checklist, just a silent agreement sealed by obligation and centuries of tradition. You owe your okiya. You owe your future. You owe your knees, which have become an unfortunate casualty in this war of subtle smiles. So you become a specialist in emotional labor, a kind of silent acrobatics that would make any therapist wince. Your real job isn't just to pour sake and dance, but to make every man feel like the sun rises and sets on his personal anecdote about grain tariffs. If emotional labor were a taxable commodity, you'd have single-handedly funded the Tokugawa shogunate's infrastructure projects. Some nights, things actually go well. Your dana is generous, kind, interested in poetry instead of proximity, and willing to keep your relationship at the polite remove of a tea ceremony. Other times, you find yourself dissociating so expertly that you could win awards for it, nodding along as he retells the same story about the legendary Sake spill of 1805 for the 15th time. Either way, the system isn't about affection. It's about leverage. And the only way to survive is to learn how to tilt the playing field, even as you're trussed up in 3 layers of embroidered silk with a smile so practiced it could be patented. Then, just when you think you've hit peak awkwardness, someone hands you a pair of shoes that look like architectural experiments in wood. Okobo, the infamous high platform sandals. They're less footwear and more ritualized test of survival. These hefty wooden clogs are worn only by Maiko, which means you're now expected to float, not walk, down Kyoto's narrow lanes, all while pretending you're not seconds away from a public faceplant. The Okobo do for your dignity what stiletto heels do for modern wedding guests, except heavier, louder, and with even more opportunities for humiliation. There's no cushioning, obviously, because why would anyone want comfort in a centuries-old performance of elegance? Your feet become throbbing metronomes. Your calves burn. Balance becomes a full-time occupation, and rain turns every trip to the tea house into a full-contact sport. The sound they make, a sharp, echoing clop, announces your presence with the subtlety of a parade float. It's traditional. It's beautiful. It also means anyone within 5 blocks knows exactly where you are at all times. So much for discretion. You adjust. Kind of. After a few months, you develop muscles in your ankles you didn't know could exist. You learn to fall gracefully, because falling is inevitable, but disgrace is optional. You master the art of turning corners with the slow, ceremonial precision of a royal procession. Of course, just when you think you've got it, someone decides you're ready for the 12-pound obi tied tightly around your waist. Now, you're tasked with climbing 3 flights of stairs to entertain clients, all while balancing the equivalent of a small child on your hips. Wearing okobo is a rite of passage, but it's also a walking billboard that says, still suffering, still learning. Full geisha get to wear sensible shoes. But for now, you're expected to smile through the pain, one wooden stomp at a time. Let's settle another point of confusion. A geisha is an entertainer, not a courtesan. Your job is performance, dance, music, conversation, and the kind of flirtation so subtle it could pass for a weather forecast. You are a living work of art whose power lies in what you don't reveal. The courtesan, or oiran, is also an expert performer, but her act ends in a very different kind of applause. The confusion is understandable. Both wear elaborate kimono and towering hairpieces, but there's a cheat code. If the obi is tied in the front, she's a courtesan, quick exit, quick access. If it's tied in the back, she's a geisha, slow exit, no access. You're welcome. Remember this next time someone wants a crash course in weird history. But cheat sheets only go so far when you walk into a room full of men whose only exposure to geisha is a poorly subtitled samurai drama. So, you acquire another essential skill. The art of correcting someone while making them feel like the world's leading expert on Japanese etiquette. This is linguistic aikido. You say, "How wonderful that you're interested in our traditions. They're quite unique, aren't they?" You smile, you pause, you redirect, and then you do it again. You'll give this speech 100 times in your career, and every time you manage to sound just as gracious as the first. Because every time you do, you re-establish the line between myth and reality, one smooth sentence at a time. Above all, the true test of your training is learning how to say no without ever using the word. Direct refusal? That's for amateurs. No one pays a geisha to be blunt. Your value is measured in suggestion, in the ability to pivot away from a sticky proposition with the grace of a butterfly in getter sandals. Picture this. A client leans in too close, his compliments growing bolder, and suddenly he asks for a private meeting. You don't recoil, you don't frown. Instead, you tilt your head and reply, "You must be very popular with women." This phrase is a masterpiece, empty flattery, a gentle redirection, and just enough time to refill his cup and move on as though nothing happened. Another favorite, "What a shame, I'm terribly busy that day." You're always busy, even when he hasn't specified a day. A geisha's schedule is an enigma wrapped in silk and plausible deniability. Sometimes a soft chuckle and a change of subject will do the trick. It's a dance, and you're always leading, even if he never realizes it. Over time, you become fluent in the secret language of gentle rejection, able to decline 3 times in one conversation, while leaving the other person convinced they're still the center of the universe. It's exhausting, yes, but it's also an art form, passed down from senior to junior, like a set of spells hidden in fan movements and subtle glances. Because, in the end, your real job isn't to indulge desire. It's to manage it, redirect it, and keep the room enchanted while making sure you're still steering the ship. And when all else fails, there's always the classic smile, bow, and say, "Such an interesting thought." Somehow, that phrase is enough to diffuse most situations. At first glance, the okia seems serene, paper walls glowing in lamplight, the faint strum of the shamisen drifting through the halls. But make no mistake, beneath the surface, it's a battlefield. Not with swords or shouting, though. No, geisha wars are more insidious, waged with compliments, glances, and the occasional accidental spill. Every geisha house is its own ecosystem, teeming with hierarchies, alliances, and the kind of rivalry you can only get when a group of highly trained performers are forced to share bathrooms and brushes. You're surrounded by women who are smart, ambitious, and skilled at smiling through gritted teeth. Did someone borrow your obi without asking? How thoughtful. Did another Maiko show up to dinner with the exact same seasonal hairpin? Coincidence, surely. Did your solo get reassigned at the last minute to someone who just happens to be the Okasan's favorite? Just a misunderstanding, one that conveniently benefits the misunderstander. You learn quickly. Not every smile is friendly, not every compliment is sincere, and never, under any circumstances, leave your cosmetics unattended. There's a code to these skirmishes. You don't shout or sulk. That's for the untrained. Here, revenge is delivered with a bow and a smile. Maybe it's a slightly off-kilter haiku at the next poetry night. Maybe it's a correction in front of a client, delivered as gentle instruction but meant as a reminder. Or maybe it's a quietly whispered rumor that spreads through the okia faster than last week's cold. Rumors, after all, are the lifeblood of any self-respecting hierarchy. You might try to rise above it, But eventually you'll be drawn in. Perhaps you're the new favorite, or perhaps your dance was just a little too well received. Or maybe someone woke up and chose pettiness that morning. Suddenly, your sandals are missing. Coincidence? Absolutely. You learn the art of strategic graciousness, the ability to give a compliment that's actually a challenge. Your new kimono is so bold. I could never wear something so daring. That translates to, I see you, and so does everyone else. Eventually, with luck and patience, you'll ascend the ranks. As a full geisha, you get your own room, your own clients, and far fewer accidental spills on your best kimono. But until then, welcome to the silent fan wars. They're ruthless, fought with timing, poise, and the kind of eyebrow raise that could launch 1,000 rumors. You don't need armor here. You need a sharp memory, a quick mirror check, and the ability to say thank you like it's both a compliment and a warning. And yet, through all of this, the ritualized suffering, the subtle sabotage, the endless emotional labor, you keep smiling. Because, as you've learned, the greatest power in the okia isn't the loudest voice or the fanciest kimono, but the quiet mastery of surviving tradition, one poised moment at a time. Now, after years of discipline and restraint, your transformation from apprentice to geisha and your place in history's long parade of performers awaits. At long last, you wake up and realize something's changed. No, there's no fanfare, no parade of lanterns, and definitely no congratulatory fireworks. Your hair doesn't spontaneously style itself. Your knees don't suddenly stop creaking. But you are no longer a mo. You are now, officially, terrifyingly, a geisha. The transformation from apprentice to geisha is about as subtle as a change in tea temperature, barely noticeable, but apparently life-altering. You wake up, and instead of being the girl awkwardly trailing behind someone else, you become the very standard everyone else is straining to imitate. It's like being promoted to manager, but without the raise, and with even stiffer shoes. Your wardrobe undergoes its own quiet revolution. Remember those wildly colorful, high-sleeved mokimono that made you look like a particularly festive bouquet? Those are gone. Now you wear something that whispers rather than shouts, subdued, elegant, the sort of thing that says, yes, I have survived, and I have opinions. I just choose not to share them with you. You finally get to trade in your daily hair ordeal for something more stable. Instead of having your hair sculpted each week into a marvel of wax and hope, you now wear a wig. True, it's less a lightweight accessory and more a small decorative helmet. But at least you're spared the fear of waking up with stray hairpins stabbing you in the scalp. Sleep. Well, sleep is still an elusive luxury. But now, at least you can lie down on your futon without worrying that your hair will collapse like a failed soufflé. But here's the real shift. You're no longer following. You're leading. Suddenly, you're the one performing solo, not as a sidekick, but as the main event. You host, you entertain, you charm, and you do it all without a safety net. Your shamisen solos stretch longer, your conversations are sharper, your wit is more finely honed. You're expected to be calm, poised, and, most importantly, entirely in control. The clients don't see you as the adorable apprentice anymore. Now, they see you as powerful. Not powerful in the sword-wielding, castle-burning sense, but in the way that a single, perfectly timed eyebrow raise can send an entire table into nervous silence. You've mastered subtlety, and you've learned to weaponize grace. Your words aren't just heard, they're anticipated. But the true art, as any geisha will tell you in a rare moment of honesty, is knowing when not to speak. Power, it turns out, is often found in the silence between sentences. And now, that silence is all yours. Of course, with this new status comes a fresh set of burdens. You're now responsible for mentoring the next wave of Mo, those nervous apprentices with stiff bows and even stiffer knees. You must keep smiling at clients whose jokes you've already heard and politely laughed at 1,000 times. You carry the weight of legacy, of centuries of ritual, of being part of a living tradition that demands both perfection and invisibility. Your life becomes a careful balancing act between being seen and being remembered. But here's the part no one warns you about. Deep down, something inside you shifts. You're no longer pretending. The endless repetition, the corrections, the ritualized gestures, they've sculpted you into someone new. You're not just a woman in a kimono. You're a symbol. You are the living embodiment of refinement, mystery, and emotional labor, so perfectly calibrated that it could probably be patented. You have become the tradition. So, you've survived. You've danced, poured tea, smiled until your facial muscles have their own muscle memory, and you've managed to avoid tripping in Okobo long enough to reach this unspoken chapter of the story. What happens now? Because here's the secret. Geisha don't really retire. There's no grand ceremony where someone hands you a gold fan and a heartfelt thank you note. There's no pension plan, no official send-off. You just slowly fade from center stage, like a candle that's reached the end of its wick. The world grows dimmer, but you burn on, quietly, in the corners. Some geisha transform into teachers, becoming the ones who correct a bow angle with a single withering glance. You demonstrate the shamisen for the 100th time, while the apprentice in front of you is probably thinking about what's for lunch. You become living proof that grace ages better than fashion, and that elegance is less about the kimono and more about the way you hold your head. Others become house mothers, the legendary Okasan. Yes, her. That stern figure who once judged your bow as if it were a criminal offense. Now it's you, standing by the sliding door, scrutinizing the latest shikomi with the resigned suspicion of someone who suspects the rice pot is burning again. You run the house. You set the rules. You decide who gets to advance and who gets to scrub the entryway for another month, all based on how well they can glide instead of stomp. There are those who marry, always discreetly, sometimes strategically, and occasionally even to a former Dana who's managed to survive long enough and possesses the rare gift of never asking what anything costs. You swap one performance for another, trading the art of entertaining patrons for the art of smiling through domestic chores. But for many, the performance simply continues, slower and quieter, the sharp edges softened but never dulled. You host more intimate gatherings. You speak less, but when you do, people listen. Your presence carries more weight now. Your nod can shift the mood of a room. Your absence is noticed in ways your debut never was. There's no dramatic exit, no final curtain call. You just slip quietly into the background, still wrapped in silk, still moving with the grace of a poem composed for the ankle joints. Even as your public appearances dwindle, your name lingers. It's passed down by younger Geisha, who continue to practice the gestures you perfected years ago. By now, your knees have molded themselves to the shape of tatami mats. Your back straightens automatically, as if the posture were tattooed onto your bones. Your voice, always melodic, now holds even more power, not because it's loud, but because it's rare. You're no longer just a geisha. You are memory, given shape and substance. You won't find your name carved into stone or printed in the official histories. You won't trend on social media. There's no viral video of you pouring tea with surgical precision or reciting waka poetry between shamisen notes. But your legacy isn't the kind that needs headlines. It lives on in the next girl, kneeling too long on legs that fell asleep halfway through the ceremony, desperately trying not to smudge her lip paint as she rehearses a half-smile that conceals exhaustion and radiates charm. It survives in the way a fan opens, snapping crisp, silent, and precise, a gesture older than most empires. It endures in the quiet gaps between words at a party, where your presence bends the atmosphere, even if nobody recalls your debut date or the name of the first client who gifted you a seasonal comb. Your job was never to be loud, never to be obvious. It was to be unforgettable in a way that most people couldn't quite explain. To captivate, not seduce. To suggest rather than declare. To turn an ordinary meal into a ceremony and a glance into a statement. And through it all, you survived. You survived the training, the crushing weight of tradition, and the shoes that seemed designed by someone with a vendetta against ankles. You made it through the assumptions, the relentless competition, the clients who confused performance with permission, and the rumors that faded only slightly faster than your patience. But above all, you survived with elegance in a world that demanded perfection, without complaint, without spectacle, and without ever raising your voice. You made room for your own sense of self within a system that was never meant to accommodate it. You carved out a life that was equal parts performance and quiet defiance, existing at the delicate crossroads of tradition and resistance. And maybe, just maybe, your name won't be spoken aloud in the grand tale of Kyoto. But someone, somewhere, will sip tea with perfect composure. Someone will glide across tatami in a kimono, not making a sound. Someone will smile with that same unreadable gaze and say just enough, and not a word more. And in that moment, you'll still be there. Not as a ghost, but as legacy itself. Of course, while you're savoring the subtle immortality of tradition, the rest of the world has its own rules about legacy. If you thought Geisha had it rough, just wait until you see what marriage looked like in ancient Sumer, Egypt, Sparta, and India. Forget candle-lit dinners, whispered sweet nothings, or swiping right for love at first sight. In ancient Sumer, the birthplace of civilization and, perhaps less romantically, of bureaucracy, marriage had almost nothing to do with romance and everything to do with paperwork. Love was strictly optional. Contracts, on the other hand, were mandatory. Think less. You complete me, more. Please initial here, here, and here. You are a Sumerian, living over 4,000 years ago in the fertile riverlands of what is now southern Iraq. Your love life, if you can call it that, is about to be immortalized not in poetry, but in wet clay. Picture yourself hunched over a low table as a scribe, stylus in hand, carefully presses the terms of your marriage into a cuneiform tablet. This isn't a heartfelt letter to your beloved. It's a legal document, spelling out exactly what's at stake. Your dowry might include a patch of barley field, a few sheep, maybe a servant or two. The groom's family, showing their commitment, will offer a bride price, less a tender gesture, more a security deposit. If things go south, the contract has you covered. What gets refunded, what gets forfeited, and what gets repossessed is all laid out centuries before anyone invented the term prenup. Your love life could, quite literally, be audited. Imagine a temple clerk squinting at your marital ledger, double-checking the tally of goats and textiles. Geisha. But the Sumerians didn't stop at financial engineering. For them, marriage was the basic building block of social order. Your union isn't just about you and your spouse. It's about keeping the machinery of inheritance, agriculture, and cosmic harmony running smoothly. Women are expected to be loyal, fertile, and quietly indispensable. Men are supposed to provide, protect, and, if possible, avoid embarrassing their families during public rituals. If you're caught straying as a wife, the consequences can be fatal. Death by drowning is on the menu. Divorce is possible, but only if you have real evidence. We grew apart doesn't qualify as just cause. As for the wedding itself, don't expect a lavish spectacle. There's no parade of white dresses, no 7-tiered cake, no cousin embarrassing himself on the dance floor. The ceremony is modest, maybe even drab by modern standards. You and your new spouse move in together, perform a smattering of household rituals, perhaps invoking deities like Inanna or Enlil for good measure, and that's it. The real moment of matrimony comes when the community acknowledges your union and the contract is filed away, as if you're submitting an ancient tax return. Congratulations, you are now a cog in the machinery of Sumerian society. In Sumer, marriage is not a personal odyssey or a quest for fulfillment. It's a civic obligation, a small but crucial part in the grand, muddy ballet of inheritance and survival. Your spouse is less a soulmate and more a strategic partner in the endless struggle to survive floods, raise goats, and keep the neighbors talking about someone else's problems. Love, if it shows up at all, is a pleasant bonus. Now, travel forward, still in your trusty, ever-discomforted skin, down the Nile to ancient Egypt, where marriage is not just a social contract, but a mirror image of the gods themselves. In Egypt, the divine order is reflected at every level, and that includes matrimony. The gods are a romantic bunch, Isis and Osiris, Nut and Geb. Even primordial chaos gets paired off. Egyptians believed that these divine couples keep the universe in balance, and humans should do the same. No pressure. Your marriage is supposed to keep the cosmos from unraveling. Marriage in Egypt is considered the ideal state. Men are expected to marry young before bachelor life leads them too far astray, and women typically wed in their early teens. Here, While love is rarely the headline, companionship and affection do show up in the fine print. Egyptian love poetry is surprisingly tender, especially for a society that mummifies its dead. One scribe confesses, "My heart flutters hastily when I think of you." Another admirer is smitten with a woman's hair. Clearly, some things never change. Legal documents still play a starring role, especially among Egypt's upper crust. Like their Sumerian forebears, Egyptians draft contracts detailing property rights, dowries, and what happens if things fall apart. But there's a twist. Egyptian women have notable legal rights. You, as an Egyptian wife, can own property, initiate divorce, and even sue your husband if he fails to provide bread, beer, or, in emergencies, oil for the lamp. If your spouse neglects you, you can drag him to court, a privilege that, sadly, doesn't extend to most of the ancient world. Of course, Egyptian marriage has its own set of quirks. Incestuous unions are common among royals. Pharaohs routinely marry their sisters, not because of slim pickings on the dating scene, but to mimic the gods and preserve their sacred bloodlines. If you're a royal, keeping it in the family is less taboo and more divine protocol, even if it occasionally leads to genetic surprises. As for the wedding ceremony, don't expect a circus. There's no priest, no parade, no grand spectacle. Once you and your spouse move in together and start sharing a household, you are considered married. That's it. The gods don't need confetti or bouquets. Children are the true focus of marriage in Egypt. Love is optional. Producing heirs is compulsory. If your wife can't conceive, you might take a concubine or a second wife. Fertility trumps fidelity. The more children, the better, because lineage is everything. If you're looking for romance, might we recommend a different epoch? From Egypt, let's head west to Sparta, where marriage throws romance out the window and replaces it with state-mandated calisthenics. If Sumerian weddings are business deals and Egyptian unions are cosmic copycats, then Spartan marriage is a state-sponsored breeding program, camouflaged as a military maneuver. You are a Spartan. Forget candlelight. Your life is illuminated by the flickering glow of burning ambition. Boys are snatched from their families at 7, thrown into the agoga, a merciless training regime that turns children into warriors who can kill with a spoon and snack on raw turnips without complaint. Spartan girls don't get off easy either. They train in wrestling, javelin, and the fine art of sarcasm. Strength isn't just for show. It's a matter of survival. Weakness is a family disgrace. Strong children are the only acceptable outcome. Marriage here is less a love story, more a logistical operation. The ideal age for marriage? 30 for men, early teens for women, a gap that raises eyebrows even by ancient standards. Forget proposals or grand gestures. The wedding ritual is as odd as Sparta itself. The bride's head is shaved, she's dressed in a man's cloak and sandals, and left alone in a dark room. The groom sneaks in after sunset, consummates the marriage, and then sneaks back out before dawn, returning to his all-male barracks. That's right. Even after tying the knot, Spartan men don't live with their wives. The relationship is built on secrecy and stolen moments. Imagine ancient Tinder with a curfew and no messaging allowed after midnight. Why the cloak and dagger routine? Spartan logic says too much familiarity breeds softness, and softness is the enemy. Mystery, they argue, keeps desire alive, though modern couples therapists might have a few notes. Spartan women, however, do enjoy a kind of power rarely seen elsewhere in the ancient world. They can own land, manage estates, and, most importantly, insult men in public with impunity. Where other cultures pen love poems, Spartans trade barbs. The classic Spartan send-off. Come back with your shield, or on it. Translation? Don't embarrass me. Spartan marriage is less about love and more about producing the next generation of hard-edged citizens. Your role, as either spouse, is clear. Keep the bloodline strong, the household in order, and the state's reputation for toughness intact. Now let's pivot east, where the air is thick with incense and the weight of tradition. Welcome to ancient India. If Sumerian marriage is a business contract and Spartan marriage is a military maneuver, Indian marriage is a spiritual journey, a sacred duty governed by the relentless logic of Dharma. You are born into the Vedic tradition, where marriage is a rite of passage, a samskara, essential for fulfilling your duties to family, ancestors, and society at large. This isn't just a union between two people. It's a bond that links families, lineages, and sometimes entire villages. Your marriage isn't just your business. It's everyone's business. Arranged marriages are the rule, not the exception. Astrologers pore over your horoscope, scrutinizing the stars and planets to determine whether your union will bring cosmic harmony or cosmic disaster. If the alignment is right, it's assumed that earthly peace, prosperity, and a household free of scandal will follow. In this system, a good marriage is thought to benefit not just you and your spouse, but the entire extended family, a sort of communal insurance policy against bad luck. The wedding itself is a marathon of ritual and symbolism, centered around Agni, the sacred fire. You and your partner walk 7 steps together, the Saptapadi, each step marking a vow, to nourish each other, to grow strong together, to share wealth, to live righteously, to raise healthy children, to savor life's seasons, and to remain lifelong companions. With these steps, your souls are spiritually welded together, whether you're feeling the chemistry or not. As a wife, you are the Griha Dharma Patni, the spiritual heart of the home, a partner and a moral compass. You manage the household, perform religious duties, and keep the family's ritual purity intact. Your role is domestic, but also spiritually vital. The husband is expected to protect, provide, and uphold Dharma through his own conduct. Marriage is less about romance and more about maintaining cosmic balance. Polygamy exists, especially among the elite, but monogamy is generally the ideal. Widows are expected to lead lives of austerity, though practices vary from place to place and century to century. The infamous custom of sati, where a widow immolates herself on her husband's funeral pyre, is rare in ancient times and doesn't actually fit with Vedic ideals. It emerges later, mostly as a grim footnote. So, across Sumer, Egypt, Sparta, and India, what ties these marriages together isn't love, but the relentless pressure to fit into a system, whether it's divine order, state propaganda, cosmic law, or the fine print of a clay contract. You, bearing the weight of tradition, and the ache of societal expectation, find that marriage is less a personal adventure and more a test of your ability to survive physically, emotionally, and, yes, sometimes, with your sense of humor intact. Of course, if you're still hoping for a romance-driven plot twist, don't hold your breath. Across the ancient world, love is a bonus, not a prerequisite. The real challenge is surviving the rules, rituals, and relentless scrutiny of your community, not to mention the occasional uncomfortable ceremonial head shaving. And if you're already dreaming of a culture where marriage is truly private, you might want to keep those expectations in check. Because next, we travel east to ancient China, where marriage is anything but a personal affair. Let's start with a question you never get to ask at a speed dating event. Are you marrying to honor your ancestors, or just to keep your parents from being haunted by a vengeful ghost of filial shame? Welcome to ancient China, where marriage is less about romance and more about cosmic accounting. You are not just a person in love. You're a crucial link in a vast intergenerational spreadsheet, maintained obsessively by both the living and the dead. Here, your family doesn't so much suggest marriage as engineer it with the precision of a lunar landing. Matchmakers, who double as amateur detectives and part-time astrologers, scrutinize every detail of your potential spouse's background. They cross-reference birth dates, comb through genealogies, and consult the stars, because nothing says happily ever after like a horoscope warning of catastrophic misalignment. Compatibility isn't measured in chemistry or long walks by the river, but in whether your union will attract good fortune or cosmic disaster. If your ancestors are displeased, they'll let you know, probably by knocking something over during the ceremony. The wedding process itself is a marathon of symbolic gestures, each more elaborate than the last. First comes the formal proposal, a negotiation between families that makes modern contract law look like a playground handshake. Then there's the exchange of names, so everyone is certain nobody's secretly marrying a long-lost cousin. Divination follows, just in case the heavens want to weigh in. Betrothal gifts are exchanged, ideally expensive enough to communicate respect, but not so lavish as to trigger suspicions of bribery. The families set a date, ideally one that won't offend any spirits or disrupt the cycle of rice planting. Finally, the ceremony arrives, and it's a masterclass in ceremonial choreography. You, the bride, are swaddled in red silk, the color of joy, luck, and just a hint of anxiety sweat. You are veiled, silent, and exquisitely passive, a living symbol of obedience gliding toward your new life in a sedan chair festooned with ribbons, carried by men whose backs will ache for days. When you arrive at your husband's home, you and your groom bow 3 times, first to heaven and earth, then to your parents, and finally to each other. The order says it all. Cosmic forces first, family second, love a distant third. Once the festivities end and the ancestors have been properly appeased, your real work begins. You are now a member of your husband's family. His parents are your new bosses, and the job description is clear. Bear sons, manage the household, and maintain a level of humility that borders on invisibility. Sure, with age and enough surviving sons, you might eventually wield some respect, but don't get ambitious. Divorce. Theoretically possible, but mostly for the man, and usually justified with vague references to disobedience or failure to produce heirs. For you, the marriage bond is sacred, a one-way ticket into a patriarchal labyrinth. Shift your gaze across the sea to ancient Japan, where marriage has its own flavor of ritual, but is seasoned with a dash more flexibility and a lingering mist of ancestral reverence. Here, the Shinto worldview reigns, and marriage is less about contracts and more about harmony between people, families, and the myriad spirits inhabiting rocks, rivers, and that tree outside your window. Instead of a rigid legal system, you navigate a maze of customs handed down through centuries, each region improvising its own variations. Purity is the watchword. Before the ceremony, you and your spouse-to-be are ritually purified, scrubbing away bad luck and spiritual grime. The centerpiece of the wedding, the sansankudo, is a sake-sharing ritual. 3 sips from 3 cups, symbolizing the union of your souls, your families, and your respective spirits. There are no vows to recite, just the subtle choreography of raised cups and meaningful glances. The symbolism does all the heavy lifting. If you're a woman in early Japan, you might enjoy a surprising degree of autonomy, at least for a while. You can inherit property, run an estate, and exercise clout within the household. In some cases, your new husband moves in with your family, not the other way around. A custom called mukoiri, which quietly defies the more common patriarchal script. Of course, this arrangement is a limited-time offer. Over the centuries, the pendulum swings back toward the familiar tune of patrilineal authority, and the bride's move into her husband's household becomes the norm. Marriage among the Japanese elite is as much about forging alliances as it is about personal happiness. Land, status, and social harmony all depend on the careful weaving of family ties. If things don't work out, discreet divorce is possible, handled with the kind of subtlety that makes the entire neighborhood pretend not to notice. Public harmony is everything, even if it means suppressing your own complaints and perfecting that serene, slightly strained smile. Polygamy is practiced among the elite, but isn't the rule. For most, the goal is to keep the family line strong, the ancestors satisfied, and the village gossip to a minimum. Now, picture yourself in ancient Rome, where marriage is proudly public and aggressively political. There's no mistaking your personal life for a private affair here. The state is not just interested. It's practically a guest of honor at the wedding. Marriage is a civic duty, a tool for forging alliances, transferring property, and producing citizens. The household is a miniature empire commanded by the paterfamilias, who has the legal authority to orchestrate marriages, dissolve them, or simply glare at you until you comply. The Romans loved their legal categories, and marriage comes in flavors to suit every power dynamic. The most traditional is cum manu, where you, the bride, are transferred out of your father's household and into your husband's, becoming legally akin to his daughter. Your property, your autonomy, and your sense of self are all handed over as part of the dowry package. Over time, though, Roman women start to negotiate better terms. Enter sine manu, a more modern arrangement where you remain under your father's legal authority and keep your property. It's a small but significant crack in the marble pedestal of patriarchy. Roman wedding ceremonies are full of spectacle and symbolism. The bride dons a flame-colored veil, the flammeum, and her hair is parted into 6 sections with the tip of the spear, because nothing says happily ever after like a nod to Rome's martial origins. The joining of hands, the dextrarum iunctio, seals the union, and offerings are made to the household gods, especially Juno, who oversees marriage and, presumably, the inevitable marital disputes. After the ceremony, there's a formal procession to the groom's house, where you're greeted with fire and water, symbols of purification, and a warning that things might heat up if you don't do your chores. If you're a member of the Roman elite, your marriage is a chess move in a high-stakes game of politics. Your feelings are considered, but only if they don't interfere with the family's ambitions. Emperors arrange marriages for leverage, senators swap daughters like diplomatic tokens, and personal affection is something you hope for, but never count on. Women in Rome are expected to be modest, loyal, and adept at running the household. Under Sin Manu, some women manage to amass property and even initiate divorce. And divorce is common, handled with a straightforward declaration in front of witnesses. If things sour, you can part ways with a simple, "I go where you go, but now I go somewhere else." It's efficient, if not exactly romantic. Let's detour into ancient Hebrew society, where marriage is sacred contract and spiritual covenant, all rolled into one. Here, you're not just making a promise to your spouse, but entering into an agreement that echoes the divine bond between your people and God. The commandment to be fruitful and multiply is not just a suggestion, it's a foundational expectation. Early marriage is the norm, and love is a bonus, not a prerequisite. Families arrange marriages with meticulous care, weighing kinship ties, reputations, and property. The groom pays a bride price, the moha, to your family, not as a purchase, but as a gesture of commitment and security. You're likely a teenager, while your new husband is a little older, hopefully mature enough to keep a goat alive and a roof intact. Ceremonies unfold at home with feasts, wine, singing, and the reading of sacred texts. The joy is collective, the anxiety palpable. A written contract, the ketubah, spells out your husband's obligations, food, clothing, and conjugal rights. It also protects your rights if things go south, at least in theory. Patriarchy is woven into every thread of the social fabric, but women are honored within the home, celebrated as wise and industrious. The woman of valor is praised in Scripture, even as her actual powers are circumscribed by law and custom. Polygamy exists, especially among the patriarchs, but monogamy gradually becomes the ideal. Divorce is permitted, but not encouraged. A man can issue a get, a writ of divorce, but only under certain conditions and after consultation with religious authorities. The aim is to avoid leaving women vulnerable or dishonored, though the scales are rarely balanced. Now, let's head northwest to the lands of the ancient Celts, where marriage is a wilder, less predictable affair, part tribal oath, part seasonal festival, and part social experiment. Here, you're surrounded by misty hills, ancient oaks, and the ever-watchful eyes of druids, tribal elders, and the gods of land and sky. Marriage is an adaptable bond, shaped by personal choice, social duty, and the shifting rhythms of nature. There's no single rule book. Customs vary from Ireland to Gaul to the Scottish Highlands, but a few themes stand out: partnership, fertility, and honor. Your wedding isn't just a celebration, it's a ritual act that binds you to the land, your tribe, and the supernatural. You make your vows in front of the community, elders, and sometimes the local druid, who is part priest, part judge, and part professional rain delay announcer. Celtic marriage can be monogamous or polygynous, depending on your wealth and status. If you're a chieftain, you might have several wives, each with her own standing and household. The arrangement is governed by clear expectations and, believe it or not, mutual agreement. Women in Celtic society are not passive spectators. They can own property, initiate divorce, and sometimes even propose marriage. One especially striking feature is the trial marriage, a year and a day of living together on a provisional basis. If either of you decides it's not working, you can separate with no stigma, just a polite handshake and maybe a discreet bonfire. Ceremonies often coincide with festivals like Beltane, when the air is thick with wood smoke, wildflowers, and the possibility of rain. Couples leap over flames or pass between bonfires to symbolize purification and union, while the community looks on, half in reverence, half in anticipation of the post-wedding feast. The rituals are believed to bless the marriage with strength, fertility, and harmony with the natural world. Marriage contracts, especially among the elite, are detailed, covering dowries, property, and inheritance, and spelling out mutual responsibilities. Abuse or neglect is grounds for dissolution, and women can seek justice in tribal courts, where the druid doubles as both therapist and legal arbiter. The spiritual dimension is ever present. Your vows are not just personal promises, but threads woven into the larger fabric of clan, land, and the gods themselves. Across all these civilizations, marriage is never just a matter of two hearts meeting. It's a performance, an act of ritual, a negotiation, and a submission to forces, familial, cosmic, tribal, or legal, much larger than yourself. The tension between who you are and what's expected of you is the real story behind the elaborate costumes, the ceremonial discomfort, and the generations of carefully choreographed obedience. If you're still awake and your knees haven't gone numb from all the bowing and ritualized standing, you might be wondering what happens when tradition builds something a little less romantic, like a fortress. Because the next stop in our journey leads us to the windswept plains of medieval Europe, where the stakes of power, faith, and architecture are about to rise higher than any wedding canopy. The origins of Malbork Castle lie not in the misty forests of Poland, but in the searing heat of the Holy Land. You are standing at the edge of the Nogat River, the sharp scent of wet brick and wood smoke thick in the air, and you can practically feel the weight of centuries pressing down around you. But to truly understand the rise of Malbork Castle, yes, the real, impossible to pronounce Malbork, not some fairy tale fortress, you have to begin far from the chilly Baltic lowlands. Picture yourself in the dust and chaos of the Third Crusade, somewhere in the blazing heat of Akko. The year is 1190, and you're sweating through layers of wool and mail, because apparently Comfort is a sin. Here, surrounded by the groans of wounded crusaders and the clangor of desperate prayers, you're initiated into the Teutonic Order. At first, your job is to bandage wounds and murmur pious platitudes, but everyone knows the real action is on the battlefield. You're part nurse, part knight, and wholly obsessed with the idea of a Christian world order, one where faith and sword go hand in hand. But the sands of the Holy Land are slipping away beneath your boots. Saladin's armies are reclaiming city after city, and the European kings who sent you here are quietly losing interest, distracted by local squabbles, bad weather, or just the medieval version of a really long nap. So what's a zealous, armor-clad monastic to do when the Holy Land is out of reach? You pack up your relics, your banners, and your slightly singed dignity, and you go looking for a new crusade. Enter Duke Conrad of Masovia, a man plagued by raids from the wild, pagan Prussian tribes to his north. He invites you, yes, you and your ever-so-humble order, into his lands, promising territory in exchange for your protection and a little light conversion work. Of course, you're not just thinking about saving souls, you're thinking about building an empire. With the Pope's blessing and the Emperor's nod of approval, you march north. The air gets colder, the forests thicker, and the pagans, well, more stubborn. But you're not deterred. You lay the first bricks of what will become Malbork Castle in 1274. At this point, it's not yet the world's largest fortress, but it's already a statement, a gigantic red brick monument to your ambition and divine mission. The locals call it Mary's Castle, a nod to the Virgin Mary, the Order's patron, and perhaps a gentle reminder that you're supposed to be holy, not just heavily armed. From the very beginning, Malbork is more than a pile of bricks. It's a declaration to the world. Here stand the Teutonic Knights, masters of war and worship, and please note the clever indoor plumbing. Most castles in Europe are built of stone, cold, grey, and eternally damp, but not yours. No, you're a trendsetter. You build with red brick, the signature material of the north, so the fortress glows like a warning at sunset, visible for miles across the flat, wind-whipped plains. Every arch, every turret, every finger-numbing stone is meant to intimidate and inspire in equal measure. Step through the massive gates and you're greeted by the relentless geometry of Gothic architecture. The castle unfolds in 3 distinct sections: the High Castle, the Middle Castle, and the Lower Castle. Each is walled, moated, and bristling with defences, because you're nothing if not thorough. The High Castle is the spiritual heart. This is where you live, pray, and plot your next expansion. The chapel hums with the sound of daily prayers. The chapter house echoes with arguments over policy, and the monks' quarters are chilly reminders that comfort is still considered suspect. Sunlight filters through narrow windows, casting stripes of colour over polished tile and worn flagstone. The ceilings soar, vaulting upward in a not-so-subtle reach for heaven, and every shadow on the floor is a metaphor for the eternal battle between divine order and the chaos lurking outside. Nothing in Malbork is accidental. The Church of the Holy Virgin, nestled in the High Castle, is a riot of stained glass and intricate tile, crowned by a statue of Mary that gazes sternly down at all who enter. Even the latrines are a point of pride, draining efficiently into the Nogat River. a small, sanitary triumph in a world where most castles are content to let nature take its foul course. You are not here to wallow in filth. You are here to bring order, both spiritual and architectural, to a land considered wild and unredeemed. By the dawn of the 14th century, Malbork is more than just a stronghold. It's a physical manifestation of your order's ambition, a place where war and prayer are two sides of the same coin. Craftsmen and masons labor year-round, their backs bent, hands raw from brick and mortar as the castle expands ever outward. Local peasants are pressed into service, carting timber and food to feed your endless appetite for growth. The castle pulses with activity. Blacksmiths hammer out armor, scribes record the slow creep of your territory, and somewhere a hapless initiate is learning the fine art of pretending he enjoys fasting. Malbork becomes the administrative and spiritual heart of a new theocratic state. Here, you and your brethren wield absolute power, ruling like a cross between a medieval CEO and a particularly pious warlord. The Grand Master, perched at the top of this rigid hierarchy, is equal parts king and pope, administering a realm where the only thing tougher than the rules is the porridge. Beneath him are knights, priests, and lay brothers, each bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet somehow finding time to manage vast estates, collect taxes, and oversee trade caravans. Your job isn't just to save souls anymore. It's to build a state, one where forests are cleared, towns are founded, and pagan traditions are either stamped out or carefully rebranded as Christian holidays. Malbork is your capital, your fortress, and your stage. Here, the chapter house debates policies that will shape the fate of the Baltic. The treasury, locked behind layers of fortification, guards not just gold and silver, but relics and diplomatic treaties, a medieval version of the ultimate safe deposit box. Armories are stocked with swords and armor, ready for the next crusade into Lithuania or the defense of your hard-won borders. Out in the countryside, roads and bridges begin to knit your new territory together. Trade flourishes along the Vistula, with German merchants and settlers invited to establish towns filled with Gothic cathedrals and market squares modelled on those of the Holy Roman Empire. The landscape changes, and so does daily life. The region once known for its pagan wildness becomes famous for its rigid order, its alphabet soup of rules, and the ever-watchful gaze of the Black Cross. Of course, not everyone is thrilled about this new regime. Poland and Lithuania, still stubborn, still fiercely independent, resist your advances at every turn. Sometimes, conversion is peaceful. More often, it's enforced with the sharp end of a sword and a baptismal font that doubles as a dunk tank. The borderlands seethe with tension. Raids are frequent, and you spend more nights than you'd like, huddled in armor, listening for the telltale sounds of enemy scouts. But inside Malbork's walls, you feel untouchable. The fortress is impregnable, or so you tell yourself, and the Order's power seems absolute. At its zenith, the Teutonic Order controls a swath of territory stretching from the icy Baltic shores deep into Eastern Europe. And at the center of it all, Malbork Castle stands unchallenged. A capital, a monastery, a monument to the fusion of faith, steel, and architectural bravado. The castle is a living thing, its halls echoing with the footsteps of generations, its towers bristling with banners, its windows aglow with the endless flicker of candlelight. Here, you are both ruler and servant, conqueror and penitent, and every day is a new negotiation between the demands of heaven and the duties of governance. But history, as you'll have noticed by now, loves nothing more than a dramatic reversal. The more power you accumulate, the more enemies you create. By the late 14th century, the Teutonic Order finds itself surrounded, not just by disgruntled locals, but by newly united kingdoms with ambitious monarchs and long memories. In 1386, the tectonic plates of European politics lurch beneath your feet. Grand Duke Jogala of Lithuania, the last great pagan holdout, converts to Christianity and marries Jadwiga, Queen of Poland, becoming King Władysław II, Jagiellon's. With one royal wedding and a splash of holy water, Lithuania embraces Christianity, and the Order's favorite excuse for crusade. The stubborn paganism of its neighbors vanishes overnight. Suddenly, your claims to divine mission ring a little hollow. Lithuania and Poland, now united by faith, family, and mutual exasperation, turn their gaze on you. It's not just about religion anymore. It's about land, prestige, and payback. Old border skirmishes flare into outright war. The region becomes a chessboard, and you are, rather unfortunately, playing against grandmasters. The final reckoning comes in 1410, at the Battle of Grunwald. Imagine the fields, muddy, churned up by thousands of boots and horse hooves, the air thick with sweat, the clang of steel, and the kind of tension you don't shake off with a prayer. The Teutonic Knights, decked out in full armor and the finest black crosses, march out to meet the combined might of Poland and Lithuania. You are confident. Maybe too confident. The knights are crushed. The Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen falls in battle, and the Order's army is scattered like so many dominoes. The shock waves ripple through your territories, and suddenly the air inside Malbork's walls feels much colder. But the story doesn't end with defeat on the battlefield. The Polish-Lithuanian alliance, sensing victory, marches straight for your fortress. Malbork, the unbreakable castle, is about to be tested. You brace for siege. Supplies are hoarded, gates are barred, and the new Grand Master, Heinrich von Plauen, proves to be a master strategist, equal parts cool-headed and ruthless. Siege engines rumble into place, catapults hurl stones, arrows fly, and boiling oil sizzles down murder holes. Disease and hunger creep through the ranks of the besiegers, and for 2 months the castle holds. The defenders, half-starved and wholly stubborn, refuse to yield. Eventually, the attackers withdraw, frustrated and depleted. You, inside the walls, breathe a shaky sigh of relief. The fortress has survived, but something essential has changed. The aura of invincibility is gone. The world outside no longer trembles at the sight of your banners. The Teutonic Order still stands, but the cracks are spreading. Malbork's mighty walls have held fast, but the empire they protected is beginning to collapse from within. And so, as you stand in the cold shadow of those red brick towers, You can feel the shift in the air, a sense that the golden age is over. The rituals continue. The prayers echo off the stone. But the certainty that once filled every corridor now feels as fragile as candlelight in a draughty hall. The castle, for all its grandeur, has become a monument not just to power, but to the costs of ambition and the inevitable ebb of every empire. But of course, the story of Malbork doesn't end here. Though Malbork Castle had survived the siege of 1410, the Teutonic Order was never the same. What happens to a fortress when the empire it guarded starts to fall apart? That's where we're headed next. You are no longer the crusader monk, nor the scheming merchant, nor the royal dignitary marveling at the tapestries. Instead, imagine yourself as Malbork Castle itself. You have lived many lives, worn many faces, and survived the sort of existential crises that would leave even the most self-assured social institution reaching for a stiff drink. Once you were the iron heart of the Teutonic Order, brick and mortar, discipline and prayer, steel and silence. You stood tall, your walls bristling with banners and cross-shaped loopholes, the sound of armored boots hammering through your corridors like a relentless drumbeat. You were the symbol of certainty, of God's will rendered in red brick and Gothic arch. The world outside trembled at the mention of your name, and your halls echoed with the strategic whispers of men who believed history itself bent to their rituals. But then, as always, history decided to get creative. After the disastrous Battle of Grunwald, you could feel the shift, power leaking from your foundations, not in sudden cracks, but in the slow, insidious seep of debt and discontent. The knights who once swaggered through your corridors now muttered about unpaid mercenaries and looming bankruptcy. The relentless taxes squeezed from townspeople and merchants were no longer seen as holy tribute, but as a slow, bureaucratic mugging. The air grew thick with resentment, and your once proud banners began to look a little threadbare. You watched as old loyalties frayed and snapped. In 1454, the Prussian Confederation, a motley alliance of nobles and merchants who had finally reached their breaking point, turned away from the order and offered themselves to the Polish king. You, of course, had no say in the matter. You simply stood, as you always had, watching the world rearrange itself around you. The resulting war, 13 years of grinding attrition, was less a clash of chivalry and more a drawn-out exercise in human stubbornness and creative accounting. Ironically, your greatest transformation came not with a final siege or an explosive breach, but with a grim little transaction. In 1457, with the order's coffers emptier than a monk's wine cup after vespers, the Bohemian mercenaries garrisoning your walls were paid, or, rather, not paid. Instead, they agreed to sell you to the Polish king. No bloodbath, no gallant last stand, just silver exchanged for keys. The Teutonic knights slipped away, their dreams of theocratic empire dissolving like mist over the river. You, the world's mightiest fortress, were not conquered by sword, but by spreadsheet. Even your most dramatic moments, it seems, could be undone by the pedestrian power of economics. Now, under new management, your identity shifted again. King Casimir IV of Poland saw in you not only military might, but a prize, tangible proof of Teutonic humiliation and Polish ascendancy. Suddenly, your stern halls were softened by velvet, tapestries, and the sound of laughter. Where once you hosted councils of war and silent processions of armored monks, you now held banquets, diplomatic receptions, and the occasional royal sulk. The transformation from fortress monastery to royal residence was not immediate, but it was steady. You traded the scent of oil and steel for the sweeter, if more transient, aromas of roasted game and spilled wine. Your new Polish masters renovated with a pragmatic eye. A few Gothic flourishes were retained for atmosphere, but gunpowder had changed the rules. Thick stone bastions and cannon platforms sprouted from your medieval skeleton, an awkward marriage of Renaissance firepower and monastic austerity. Your once imposing towers now bristled with artillery, and your sturdy walls were sometimes more decorative than defensive. In this new era, the threat was less about swords through the gate, more about cannonballs over the walls. Still, you were never truly the heart of anything again. The Polish kings treated you as a jewel in their crown, valuable, impressive, but not essential. They preferred their main courts in Krakow or Warsaw, leaving you to languish in the provinces, wheeled out for special occasions like an extravagantly embroidered but slightly musty ceremonial robe. You became a symbol of victory, of unity, of history's strange reversals, but you were rarely the stage for the main event. You watched the comings and goings of minor royals, local administrators, and the occasional foreign dignitary, all of them admiring your grandeur, but rarely staying long enough to warm your stones. You were, in a word, retired. Not entirely forgotten, of course. Old fortresses never quite die. But your days of martial glory were over, and you could feel the weight of irrelevance settling in, brick by brick. Then, as if to prove that history has a dark sense of humor, war returned in the 17th century. The Swedish-Polish Wars, bloody, confusing, and driven by a heady mix of religious zeal and dynastic ambition, brought armies crashing back to your gates. You stood, as always, ready for whatever new indignity awaited. But you were no longer the unbreakable bulwark you had been in the days of the Teutonic Order. Cannon fire now battered your Gothic walls, and your garrisons were smaller, less disciplined, and frequently underfed. In 1626, Swedish troops swept into Royal Prussia, and once again you became a coveted prize. The new Swedish kings dreamed of a dominium maris Baltici, complete control of the Baltic Sea. Your strategic location on the Nogat River made you irresistible. By 1656, during the period the Poles would remember as the Deluge, you finally fell, not through heroic defense, but through surrender. Food had run out, supplies were gone, and your defenders, never quite as committed as the chroniclers would have liked, opened your gates without a fight. The Swedes treated you with all the reverence of a moving company clearing out a condemned mansion. Treasures, archives, and priceless relics vanished into Stockholm, your walls echoing with the unfamiliar cadence of foreign boots. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, for which you'd been such a potent symbol, reeled from the loss. For them, it wasn't just about territory. Losing you was like misplacing a piece of their soul, a particularly expensive and now slightly damaged part. Eventually, the Swedes retreated, and the Poles returned, but you were changed. Sections of your walls had collapsed, Chapels stood empty, and your reputation as an unbreakable fortress was in tatters. You were a survivor, of course, but every siege left its mark. Your glory days were visible only in the fading outlines of once grand murals and the uneven stones beneath battered banners. By the 18th century, the world had left you behind. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth itself unraveled, torn apart by internal squabbles and the predatory appetites of neighboring empires. In 1795, the Commonwealth was erased from the map entirely, divided up like a particularly inconvenient wedding cake. Now, you found yourself in the hands of the Prussian state, a government that valued efficiency, order, and, above all, getting their money's worth out of every square meter. To the Prussians, you were less a monument to history than an inconveniently large storage unit. Gunpowder warfare had made you obsolete as a fortress. As a royal palace, you were too remote and drafty. So, bit by bit, your function was reduced to the purely practical. Your grand chapel became a warehouse. Your refectories were converted into barracks, and your chambers, once the site of strategic intrigue and courtly drama, were hollowed out to store supplies. Even your bricks were not safe. Pieces of your structure were carted off to build new, less historically significant buildings in the vicinity. Nothing says progress, quite like recycling a medieval stronghold into a shed. Most locals and officials treated you with a sort of benign neglect. You were too big to ignore, too expensive to restore, too outdated to modernize. Instead of being celebrated as a national treasure, you became a background feature in people's daily routines, a convenient landmark, a source of cheap building material, or, for the especially imaginative, a romantic ruin, perfect for a moody stroll. Your legacy, centuries in the making, was now buried beneath dust, indifference, and the slow encroachment of ivy. The stories of crusading monks, royal pageantry, and foreign occupation faded from living memory. The echoes of battle cries, prayers, and royal decrees were replaced by the drip of water through broken ceilings and the occasional exasperated sigh of a Prussian quartermaster trying to catalogue your increasingly uncooperative spaces. And yet, curiously, you didn't vanish. Travellers, mostly German, occasionally English, wandered through your neglected halls. They sketched your silhouette, marvelled at your sheer scale, and, in the way of all Romantic-era tourists, projected onto your crumbling stones the heroic fantasies of a bygone age. To them, you were less a relic of real history and more a prop in their own private epics, a backdrop for melancholy, nostalgia, and the sort of moody introspection you only get after climbing a crumbling spiral staircase. Artists and thinkers, intoxicated by the idea of medieval chivalry and the picturesque, began to see you not as a cautionary tale about the transience of power, but as a timeless symbol, a monument to something grander, nobler, perhaps even eternal. Your battered towers and ivy-choked walls became the stuff of legend, even as the reality of your condition was decidedly less glamorous. Nothing quite says timeless grandeur, like the smell of damp stone and the sound of pigeons echoing through an empty hall. Still, for all the wistful admiration and occasional artistic attention, you remained largely ignored. You were no longer defended, no longer ruled, no longer the center of anyone's universe. You stood in silence, your history packed away in forgotten corners, your grandeur muffled beneath layers of dust and modern indifference. So here you are, a castle too vast to demolish, too storied to disregard, yet too costly to resurrect. You are a paradox, at once a relic and a monument, a survivor and a casualty, a witness and a warning. The world has moved on, and all that remains is the slow, patient work of time. Your stones, worn smooth by centuries of feet and weather, hold memories like sediment, layer upon layer, waiting for the rare visitor who still cares to look. But nothing in history ever truly ends. All it takes is a shift in the wind, a change in fashion, or the sudden whim of a nation rediscovering its roots. And in the coming century, you will find yourself swept up in one final transformation, the kind that turns ruins into icons and forgotten shadows into beacons of national pride. In the 19th century, Malbrook Castle's long silence was finally broken. You're standing inside Malbrook Castle, though in your era it's known as Malbrook, or maybe Marienburg, depending on which flag is currently fluttering overhead and who's feeling most patriotic this decade. The year is somewhere in the 1800s, and you, a future social anthropologist on assignment in the body of a Prussian architect, are squinting up at a crumbling Gothic archway. Nationalism is in the air, thick as the coal smoke drifting over the Vistula River. Europe, always fond of a good identity crisis, is now obsessed with its own medieval ruins, and you've been conscripted into the cult of restoration. Malbrook's silence, which has lingered for centuries in the echoing halls, is suddenly shattered by the sound of hammers, scholarly arguments, and the shuffling of boots across uneven flagstones. The Germans, swept up in the grand project of unifying themselves into something more impressive than a collection of squabbling principalities, have decided that what they need, more than anything, is a symbol. And not just any symbol, a castle. A fortress with walls thick enough to hold all their national pride, and perhaps a little wishful thinking. You find yourself surrounded by earnest historians, each armed with a notebook and a strong opinion about the proper curvature of a Gothic window. There are Prussian artisans laying bricks with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for diffusing bombs. Their hands are chapped, their brows furrowed, and their appreciation for historical accuracy is matched only by their willingness to fudge the details when it makes for a better story. Authenticity is good, one mutters, slathering mortar, but a little romance never hurt anyone. You nod, because in the 19th century, romance is practically a building material. Restoration, you quickly learn, is less a science and more a performance. The architects debate, sometimes heatedly, whether this particular arch should be original Gothic or Gothic with a dash of 1800s flair. You watch as statues are recarved, stained glass is pieced together from shards and imagination, and entire sections are rebuilt, not quite as they were, but as people wish they had been. The castle's bones are medieval, but the flesh is part fantasy. Still, nobody seems to mind. The Germans need Malbrook to be magnificent, so magnificent it becomes something more than stone and mortar, a myth made visible. Soon, Malbrook isn't just a castle anymore. It's a shrine to Teutonic strength and knighthood. a place where emperors come to pose for portraits and schoolchildren are marched through echoing corridors, instructed to feel awe. Painters immortalize it in swirling, heroic landscapes. Writers and composers churn out operas in its honor. Each performance another layer of legend. The textbooks are thick with tales of chivalry and glory, and you, ever the observer, can't help but notice the way the past is being carefully edited for maximum dramatic effect. But history, predictably, refuses to stay politely in the past. The world shifts. Empires rise and collapse with the subtlety of a dropped piano. After World War I, the region is a political chessboard, contested and redrawn by treaties, foreign armies, and the latest round of who gets what. Malbuk's walls, which have seen more than their share of drama, now echo with uncertainty. Then 1945 arrives, and you are suddenly a witness to catastrophe. The castle, which survived centuries of sieges and squabbles, is now battered by the full force of modern war. Soviet troops advance across East Prussia, and the air is thick with the smell of burning timbers and scorched earth. Artillery shells punch through ancient brick. Fires rage through the halls, devouring what generations have painstakingly rebuilt. The roof collapses in a thunder of sparks, and the once grand chambers are reduced to heaps of blackened rubble. Your boots crunch over ashes as you pick through the ruins, the great fortress now a casualty in the long, unending struggle over identity and territory. After the war, the map changes again. Malbuk, bruised and battered, is handed not back to the Germans, but to the newly reborn Poland. The castle's identity shifts with the flick of a bureaucrat's pen. No longer a symbol of Germanic pride, it is reframed as a relic of Polish heritage, a testament not to conquest, but to survival. You get the sense that the castle itself is tired of picking sides. Its stones remember every anthem and every argument, every flag that's ever flown from its turrets. The Polish government, faced with the daunting task of restoring a castle that's been blown apart more times than most people have changed haircuts, embarks on yet another restoration. This time, the mood is different. The architects and masons, many of whom survived the war themselves, approach the work with a quiet reverence. They focus on fidelity, on honoring the layers of history rather than papering over the scars. Each brick is laid not just to rebuild, but to remember. You find yourself knee-deep in mud, sweating under the weight of tradition and the ever-present expectation that you'll get it right this time. There is no grand ceremony here, just the slow, deliberate work of putting things back together. The castle is patched, repaired, and finally, after decades, stands tall again, not as a fortress, but as a tribute to resilience. It's no longer about glory or myth-making. It's about endurance, about surviving the endless cycle of ambition and disaster. By the time you stroll through its courtyards in the modern era, Malbuk Castle has become the world's largest brick fortress, a magnet for tourists and a favorite haunt of historians. The air is thick with the sound of schoolchildren on field trips, their sneakers squeaking on ancient stone. Scholars pore over the layers of brick, tracing the scars and repairs like lines on an aging face. The castle no longer needs to defend anything. It simply remembers. The past here is not a static exhibit. It's a living, breathing thing, always shifting to reflect whoever is looking. You run your hand along the wall and feel the weight of centuries, Teutonic crusaders, Prussian architects, Polish restorers, all layered together. The stones are weary but unbroken. If walls could sigh, these would. But let's not get too comfortable in the drafty halls of European nostalgia. While Malbork is busy being reborn for the umpteenth time, something entirely different is taking shape across the Atlantic. Now, you are in the early 1800s, standing at the edge of an impossibly vast horizon somewhere in the United States. The country is young, brash, and already dreaming of stretching from sea to shining sea. The eastern cities are swelling with restless energy, but you, like so many others, are drawn to the great unknown, the so-called American frontier. Manifest destiny is the slogan of the day, and you, ever the method actor, are expected to believe that this westward urge is less about real estate and more about destiny with a capital D. You pack your meager belongings into a creaky wagon, wedge yourself between barrels of flour and a suspiciously leaky water jug, and set off into the wilderness. The promise of cheap land and fresh starts is blared from every newspaper and political speech. Land grants dangle in front of you like carrots before a stubborn mule. The journey west is painted as a grand adventure, but it's really a long, bumpy exercise in discomfort. Weeks pass in a blur of mud, blisters, and the constant threat of a broken axle. Every river crossing is a gamble. Every night, as you sleep under the stars, you dream of soft beds and hot baths, neither of which are anywhere to be found. The trail is a gauntlet. You face rattlesnakes, thunderstorms, and the ever-present possibility of dysentery, because nothing says frontier adventure quite like the humble, unglamorous dangers of bad water and worse luck. The Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, and California Trail each offer their own unique blend of hardship, but they all share that same promise. Somewhere ahead, your own plot of land awaits, if only you can survive the journey. For many, the lure of the West is more than just acreage. It's about reinvention. You could be a tenant farmer with nothing but debts in the East, but out here, you're a pioneer, at least until your boots fall apart and your last biscuit turns to dust. The American frontier is the ultimate blank slate, or so you're told. Never mind that this so-called wilderness is already home to thriving indigenous nations, whose existence is conveniently erased from most versions of the story. The contradictions pile up as fast as the hardships. The frontier offers freedom, but only to those willing to risk everything. Opportunity is a promise, but survival is the reality. The myth of the rugged individual settles into your bones, even as you realize that the only thing more reliable than your own strength is the unpredictability of the land itself. You finally stagger into your chosen patch of wilderness, battered but alive. The real work is only just beginning. There are no ready-made homes, no friendly neighbors bringing casseroles. Just trees, rocks, and the relentless cycle of weather. Your first task is shelter, a log cabin, hastily assembled from whatever you can chop down before nightfall. You notch and stack the logs, cursing every splinter and every missed swing of the axe. Nails are a luxury, so you wedge the wood together with mud and moss, praying the roof will survive the first rainstorm. Inside, the cabin is an exercise in minimalism, and not the Instagram kind. A single smoky room houses you, your family, and every possession you own. Privacy is a foreign concept. Cooking is done over a fire that seems determined to choke everyone with smoke. Bedding is a sack of straw, scratchy and occasionally alive with uninvited guests. Every object has a job. If it doesn't belong. But somehow, life pushes forward. You plant a garden, corn, beans, potatoes, watching for the first green shoots like a gambler watching dice. You hunt, you fish, you trap anything with legs or wings. Every meal is a minor miracle. Every winter a test of your ability to outwit hunger. When the harvest fails, you tighten your belt and hope the neighbors are feeling generous. Speaking of neighbors, you don't have many, but the ones you do are worth their weight in salt pork. You help each other raise barns, share seeds and stories, and gather for the occasional communal workday. You survive not just by your own grit, but by a fragile network of mutual aid, because on the American frontier, rugged individualism is largely a myth you keep telling yourself to get through the day. The land is generous and merciless in equal measure. Bears prowl the woods. Storms flatten your hard-won progress. Illness lurks in every cup of water and every cold wind. There are no safety nets, no handy government programs. You prepare, you persist, and sometimes you just get lucky. As the seasons turn, you find yourself settling into a rhythm of relentless work and cautious hope. The myth of the frontier is already being woven into the national story, embroidered with tales of courage and self-reliance. But you know better. You know that every inch of progress is paid for in sweat, in sleepless nights, and in the quiet, dogged refusal to give up. And so, as dusk falls over your cabin and Malbork's towers blow beneath a distant European sky, you realize that survival, whether in a bombed-out castle or a drafty frontier shack, is always a matter of endurance, reinvention, and the slow, stubborn transformation of both land and self. But let's not get too sentimental. The real story of the frontier isn't just about solitary struggle. As you'll see next, life out here is shaped just as much by community, conflict, and the delicate dance of daily survival. While life on the frontier is often remembered as solitary and rugged, few pioneers truly lived in total isolation. Out here on the American frontier, you quickly learn that the myth of the lone pioneer is, frankly, a bit of a joke. One of those stories future historians like myself love to debunk for a classroom full of glazed-over students. Sure, you might start off squinting through the smoke of your own hastily built fire, shivering in a drafty log cabin that looks more like a child's building project than a home. But that isolation never lasts. The truth is, as soon as you've unpacked your battered trunk and figured out which end of the axe is up, you realize that survival isn't a solo act. It's more like an awkward group project. The kind where everyone's grade depends on the neighbor who can actually raise a barn without knocking it sideways. Before long, you and your fellow settlers are less scattered hermits and more a patchwork of desperate, interdependent homesteads. There are no mayors, no convenience stores, and definitely no HOA to complain about your fence. Instead, you're bound to your neighbors by the most reliable glue in human history, mutual necessity, and a healthy fear of what happens if you try to go it alone. Every new arrival means another pair of hands, sometimes helpful, sometimes just more mouths to feed, but always another potential lifeline for when the roof caves in or the wolves get too bold. Community on the frontier isn't a matter of choice. It's pure physics. The world is too big and too indifferent for you to make it by yourself. So, you join in, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes with genuine warmth, at barn raisings, log rollings, and harvests. Picture a dozen sunburned men hoisting beams into place, while you, if you're a woman, orchestrate a culinary performance on a scale that would put today's reality TV baking competitions to shame. You chop, stir, and haul, all while keeping a suspicious eye on the children who have already gone suspiciously quiet behind the woodpile. These events are never just about work. They're your entire social calendar, therapy session, and news network rolled into one. A barn raising isn't merely a construction project. It's the frontier version of a block party. Except the only music is the clatter of tools and the occasional off-key hymn. The men grunt and sweat. The women swap gossip with the efficiency of modern social media. And the children run wild until they collapse in a heap of dirt and exhaustion. When dusk falls and the last nail is hammered in, you find yourself surrounded by laughter, the aroma of fresh bread, and the sense that, yes, for one brief moment, this life is more than just survival. It's community. Without internet, newspapers, or even the luxury of a town crier, your news comes in the form of whoever passed by most recently. Maybe it's a traveling peddler with a wagon full of questionable wares, or a neighbor who's trekked hours just to borrow a handful of nails. You hear about distant wars, government decrees, or rumors of a hard winter, all filtered through a chain of retellings that add drama, lose details, and sometimes replace facts with pure speculation. When a letter finally arrives, weeks late, battered and stained, it's read aloud again and again to anyone who will listen, transforming private words into the communal property of the settlement. Religion, too, becomes less about dogma and more about gathering. The circuit rider preacher shows up once a month, looking like he's wrestled 3 bears just to get here, and suddenly your cabin turns into a chapel. You and your neighbors cram onto rough benches for hours, because faith is the only law that shows up on time. Even if you're not particularly devout, you play along. The alternative, missing out on a rare moment of song, prayer, and the reassuring presence of others, is unthinkable on a land where the wind itself sometimes sounds like it's howling your name. If there's a critical mass of children in the area, the grown-ups will cobble together a schoolhouse. Forget the sprawling campuses of your future. This is a one-room shed, barely insulated, heated by a stove that smokes more than it warms. The teacher could be a barely grown teenager, or a grandmother whose patience is as legendary as her switch. You learn your letters by candlelight, scratch arithmetic on a slate, and recite Bible verses until your tongue is numb. Spelling bees and the occasional holiday feast serve as your fleeting glimpses of normal childhood, and you learn to treasure them, because the rest of your days are filled with chores and the never-ending threat of boredom. Of course, the frontier isn't just a story about plucky settlers taming the wilderness. It's also about collision cultures, histories, and claims to the land crashing into each other with all the subtlety of an ox cart in a thunderstorm. You, the newly arrived settler, look at the land and see promise. If you are native to the land, if your family's roots go deeper than any fence post, you see home. This is not a peaceful transition. The air is thick with tension, even on days when nothing seems amiss. Some days, the encounters are surprisingly peaceful. You might trade a hatchet for a pelt, or a length of calico for a basket of corn. Indigenous guides save more than one settler from making fatal mistakes, steering you away from quicksand, or warning of storms you would never see coming. There are moments of real friendship, shared meals, and awkwardly exchanged gifts that hint at the possibility of coexistence. You might even laugh together, at least until reality reasserts itself. But the truce is fragile, and the pressure of expansion cracks it again and again. With every new homestead, another forest disappears. Another river is diverted, and another patch of earth is claimed, fenced, and renamed. Treaties are signed with all the sincerity of a handshake at a used car lot. Promises evaporate as soon as settlers outnumber those who originally called this land home. It's not long before you are sleeping with a rifle within arm's reach, teaching your children to hide at the sound of footsteps, and listening to stories, half rumor, half warning, about raids and reprisals. For indigenous communities, the wrongs are felt with each acre lost, each hunting ground closed, and every new law that rewrites centuries of tradition overnight. The land that once supported entire nations is carved up by strangers with maps, surveyors' chains, and the unshakable belief that they belong here more. Resistance rises. Sometimes it's a skirmish in the woods, a raid under the cover of darkness. Sometimes it's a full-blown war that will echo through the generations, names like Black Hawk or Oregon Trail burned into memory. Other times, it's quieter, negotiation, adaptation, movement further west, always pursued by the creeping edge of settlement. Yet, even as the pendulum swings between fear and violence, you still find moments of cooperation. Some settlers marry into native families. Some indigenous people convert to the settlers' faith, or join in the seasonal work, or teach the newcomers how to survive winter without starving. You might learn how to use wild plants for healing, or how to track game when every animal seems to have vanished. The lines are never as clear as the history books would later claim. If you want to know who really holds the frontier together, don't look to the men in their battered hats and stiff boots. Look instead to the women, whose labor forms the invisible backbone of every homestead. The men may chop down trees, but it's the women who make the world livable. One loaf of bread, one patched shirt, and one soothing word at a time. Your day as a frontier woman starts painfully early, before the sun, before the birds, before you've had time to regret yesterday's blisters. You're up stoking the fire, milking the cow, coaxing a breakfast from the unforgiving pantry, all with children underfoot and a to-do list that will not tolerate complaints. By noon, you've churned butter, fed livestock, mended a torn shirt, and shooed a goose out of the house. If someone is sick, you're the doctor, mixing up remedies from whatever herbs haven't been trampled. If a neighbor is in trouble, you're hauling soup and comfort through mud or snow. When childbirth or death comes knocking, and it always does, You become midwife and mourner, all without the benefit of formal training or a break. The agony of a heavy skirt or a pinched shoe is just part of the uniform, and you wear it with the kind of stoic pride that would make a future anthropologist weep. You're not confined to the cabin either. When crops need tending or the field needs ploughing, you're out there with hands just as calloused as any man's. If tragedy strikes and you're left alone, the land doesn't pause for your grief. You run the homestead by sheer force of will, raising children and crops under skies that seem determined to test your limits. In your few quiet moments, you might teach a child to read from a dog-eared Bible, or jot down a recipe in a notebook that, centuries later, becomes a precious historical record. These small acts, teaching, writing, preserving, are your way of building a bridge to the future, even when it feels like the present is crumbling. Women create the emotional infrastructure of the frontier. Prayer meetings, holiday gatherings, and those mysterious mutual aid societies all begin with a whispered conversation in a smoky kitchen. When a neighbor falls ill, you organize the care. When the child dies, you dig, mourn, and remember together. Your strength is rarely loud, but it is relentless, as constant as the wind moaning through the chinks in the wall. And what of the children? If you're a frontier child, forget about toys and free time. Your schedule is packed with chores, not because your parents are cruel, but because every pair of hands is vital. You learn to tell the difference between a useful tool and a dangerous one before you know how to spell your own name. Boys split logs and feed livestock. Girls cook, milk, and mind the younger siblings. Your childhood is really just a brief training period for adulthood, and it's over before you realize what you've missed. Still, you find ways to play. A rag doll, a carved stick, a game invented in the dirt. These are your treasures. When the neighbors gather for a barn dance or a harvest, you run wild with the other children, your laughter echoing across the fields. These moments are rare and precious, and they linger in your memory long after the work resumes. If you're lucky enough to attend school, the classroom is cramped and bare, but you learn to read and write by sheer determination. You memorize Bible verses, recite lessons aloud, and scratch your answers onto a slate that's seen better days. Books are scarce, and so is paper, but you make do. Education is a privilege, not a right, and you know it. Frontier life shapes you, body and soul. You grow up fast, you toughen up faster, and you learn to see hardship not as something to be avoided, but as the price of belonging. The wind outside may rattle the windows, and the nights may stretch on forever. But inside, around the fire, you belong to something larger than yourself, a community built not on comfort, but on resilience, resourcefulness, and the stubborn refusal to give up. Of course, all these routines and rituals, all this emotional labor and strategic politeness are just the prelude to the next great ordeal. Because on the American frontier, the real test is yet to come. Winter here was not just a passing season. You are not simply enduring another season on the American frontier. You're auditioning for survival in the world's longest, coldest, least glamorous reality show. The first snow falls, and instantly the landscape transforms. Every trail you used to know vanishes beneath a relentless white silence. Rivers become solid, unyielding ribbons of ice. The trees, once promising firewood and shade, now stand stripped, as if embarrassed by their own nakedness. The wind doesn't just whistle. It interrogates every seam in your clothing, every weakness in your cabin, and every decision you've made since you landed out here. For weeks, sometimes months, you become a ghost in your own world, cut off from neighbors, news, and anything resembling civilization. Your fate hinges on just how well you prepared in those frantic weeks before the cold marched in. This means you, the enterprising settler, have spent autumn stuffing every crack in your log cabin with whatever will fit: moss, mud, scraps of old shirts, or the odd unclaimed sock. You've stacked firewood so high it threatens to take over the cabin itself. And you know that if you run out, venturing outside just to fetch more could mean a very literal case of losing your toes to history. Inside, the hearth is your son, your oven, your therapist, and your only entertainment. The fire must never be allowed to die out, because if it does, the temperature inside drops faster than your morale. Food becomes a science of grim resourcefulness. If you didn't salt enough pork, dry enough apples, or jam enough jars, you'll be dining on the gourmet specialty known as nothing. Root cellars are dug deep, further down than your sense of optimism, and lined with straw to keep potatoes, onions, and turnips alive until spring. Every meal is a study in practical monotony. Stews that taste of yesterday's stew, cornbread so dense it could double as building material, and beans that are more philosophy than flavor. But it's not just the cold or the threat of hunger that gnaws at you. It's the silence, thick and absolute. After the last snow, you might go weeks without seeing another human face. Letters from the world you left behind arrive late, if they arrive at all, creased and brittle from their own long journey. Sometimes the only sound is the wind, the muffled crunch of snow, and the endless echoing creak of the cabin as it settles, just like you, into another night of waiting. This isolation is a test that doesn't care about gender or age. For women and children especially, the loneliness can become an invisible blizzard, eroding patience and hope. Cabin fever isn't just a cliché, it's a clinical condition, though your neighbors will just call it getting a bit odd. Anxiety, sadness, and restlessness creep in, though nobody would think to call it depression. There are no therapists on the frontier, only the patient, unjudging company of your own thoughts. Passing the time becomes an exercise in creative endurance. You read the same Bible verses until you can recite them backwards. You mend clothes, patch quilts, carve spoons, and attempt to teach the children arithmetic using beans that you'll probably have to eat later. The kids invent quiet games that don't involve running, because there's nowhere to run, and learn early that toys are whatever you can whittle or sew. The rhythm of your life is measured by the fire's glow, the dwindling piles of supplies in the cellar, and the slow, stubborn passage of days. But somewhere in the midst of all this, endurance takes root. Winter is not a time for grand gestures. It's a private marathon, one foot in front of the other, waiting for the day when the sun rises a little earlier and the air doesn't bite so hard. When spring finally does arrive, when frozen creeks begin to burble with water and the first birds dare to return, you emerge from your cabin thinner, paler, but undeniably alive. By the end of the 19th century, the world you've known begins to dissolve beneath the iron rails of the railroad. Suddenly, the once endless wilderness is carved up by fences and deeds. Towns pop up where you remember only trees and sky. The census takers of 1890 will solemnly declare the frontier closed, as if wildness itself can be filed away. Homesteads morph into farms, cabins into proper houses, and the landscape of struggle becomes a patchwork of states. And yet, the story of the frontier clings to the national imagination, like the smell of wood smoke in your hair. The people who survived these winters, who built lives out of sweat, grit, and a little luck, leave behind more than just notched logs and weathered fences. They leave behind an idea that anyone with enough determination can carve a new beginning out of the wilderness. This is where the myth blooms. The American frontier gets recast in story and legend as the birthplace of rugged independence, self-reliance, and that peculiar optimism that says you, too, can start over. Just bring a strong back and a better plan for food storage. The names become shorthand for adventure and persistence. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, and Laura Ingalls Wilder, each transformed into icons of courage and cheerfulness, their struggles sanitized for mass consumption. But the truth, as always, is messier. The expansion that brought so many dreams of opportunity came at a terrible cost to native peoples, whose lands were seized, treaties broken, cultures unraveled. The environment itself was forever altered. Forests fell, rivers shifted, and wildlife was hunted to the brink, triumph and tragedy, hand in hand. Yet the stories endure, stitched together from diaries, whispered legends, and the stubborn artifacts left behind, weathered cabins, sunken wagon ruts, and hand-carved gravestones. Museums try to capture these fragments, but the real legacy is the persistent sense of possibility, the belief that hardship can forge something lasting, and that, given enough stubbornness, you might just outlast the winter, if not the myth.